Hello friends, it's Kat from Yum Yum Kapow. You may remember my video from a while back where I set up a Holbein Gouache palette and tested the paints out for the first time. Since then, I've slowly been experimenting with gouache, and I'd like to share what I've learned to help anyone else who might not be sure of how to start with this medium. A link to that video, as well as all the supplies used here, will be down in the doobly-doo. The first thing that I would recommend doing to help get a feel for how gouache works is to start off just practicing with tonal studies using only white and one other color. A lot of people say that gouache is the baby that watercolor and acrylic would have together, but I think it's a bit too close to acrylic in performance and texture to be compared with watercolor. In fact, I found that my knowledge of how to mix watercolors and actually apply them onto paper really hurt my ability to use gouache because I kept using far too much water at first. Doing these monochromatic tone studies with gouache really helped me to focus entirely on just how to control the paint itself, without having to worry about getting colors right. I only used Prussian blue and titanium white to start with. I've found that you really want to use barely any water at all if you're trying to get an even, opaque layer of color. Keep in mind that I'm working with dried gouache rather than fresh, juicy stuff, so my advice right now is entirely based off of my personal experience with dried gouache. Because you do still need some water to work with, I found it was best to keep a little spray mister nearby and spritz the paints when they got too dry, which happens often because gouache is a very thirsty paint and it dries super fast. For all of these little doodles, I went in without a plan so that I wouldn't be upset if they didn't quite work out the way I wanted. I think it's important to be really forgiving and gentle with yourself when you're learning something new. That way it's harder to get discouraged and quit from frustration. If your expectations going in are low, and that it's just meant to be fun and playful, you're less likely to let yourself down. Gouache seems to be really forgiving once you get the hang of it, because as long as you don't use too much water in your paint mix, you can layer it quite a lot to cover up any mistakes you may have made. You can also soften edges and blend things out with a very light wet brush. Again, the key here is to very barely use any water at all. As you start to work with it, you'll begin to get a feel for how much water is too much and how much is too little, because your paint will either become super transparent or you'll spend a lot of time accidentally dry brushing. One thing that I really like about this medium so far is that you can have a lot of very fine control with it, because your brush is hardly wet at all. That means you can make really quick, short, and controlled lines and dots without much effort. And even though it may seem like you don't have much pigment on your brush, I kept being surprised at how long I could go between needing to reload it with paint. Once you're comfortable enough with making something with one or two colors, it might be a good idea to try and tackle something simple that doesn't have a lot of color variation. I chose a lemon because that seemed to fit the bill quite nicely. What I started to understand as I painted my lemon was that the best way to work in color is to sort of block in each area and then either blend it out afterwards or add texture after you've got the basic shapes and tones down. When I first started doing this lemon, I tried to go in immediately with painting the texture and didn't realize until halfway through, after I'd covered the texture up a number of times with different colors, that I'd essentially wasted my time. Like most paints, the colors of gouache do shift slightly from wet to dry, and I've been told that darker colors dry lighter and lighter colors dry darker. The color shift in my experience with these Holbein artist gouache was pretty minimal, but I do think it was a little more apparent in this lemon than it was in my blue and black pieces. I kept needing to adjust the shadows and highlights because they just never quite ended up being the color I wanted. I'm glad that, at this point, I had taken the time to learn how to control the paint itself first, because mixing colors with gouache is a bit difficult for me. It seems like once you get the perfect color mixed up, you're very likely to have used all of the paint that you mixed for that layer, and trying to make more of the same color again is super difficult. By starting with just doing monochromatic doodles first, we were able to sort of control the difficulty level of adjusting to this point. Like I said, the monochrome pieces help to focus on just the texture and application of the paint itself, so that when it came to painting the lemon, the only new element was how to mix up colors, which is proving to be a pretty difficult element, really. I can see now why people say that you always need a lot of extra white when you buy gouache paints, because its ability to tint down the colors to lighter shades is completely essential. You can still make colors darker by using general color theory and mixing complementary colors to make something darker or more neutral, but you can't just add more water with gouache to make it light like you would with watercolor. For instance, I mixed in a little bit of purple with some of the shadows on the lemon because purple is the opposite of yellow on the color wheel, and that way the shading still looked like it belonged on the lemon. As a harder challenge, I decided to try and paint a light Caucasian skin tone just using red, yellow, and blue. This is something I can do easily and almost as second nature with watercolor, but having to remember that I actually need to use white in order to keep the color from being super dark was kind of trippy. I know that what I'm experimenting with here is super basic, but that's the level I'm at with gouache right now, and I'm hoping that this will help some other people who, like me, really had no idea where to start. After I did my original video, I realized that it would be best to take a bit of time to just learn how the paint itself worked, since I'm so completely outside of what I already feel comfortable with. If you're just starting out with gouache, was this helpful for you? And if you have experience with gouache, what did you do to help yourself learn it? What advice would you have for our next experiments? And of course, to appease our YouTube overlords, please consider liking and subscribing if you'd like to support this channel. Until I see you next time, I wish you peace, love, and Cave Johnson's lemon rant. Bye!